When the soldiers walked into the ruined village, they expected the usual aftermath of war smoke, shouting, "The metal smell of blood." Instead, they found silence. A silence so thick it felt like a warning. And right in the middle of that silence stood a king. Not their king. The one man they had been told should not survive this day. But let's pull back for a moment. This story comes from a chapter in the Bible many churches quietly avoid. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. 3,000 years ago, Israel had its first king, Saul. He wasn't born into royalty. He was chosen because the prophet Samuel said God wanted him. And when Samuel spoke, no one argued. So when Samuel came to Saul with a new message from God, the king listened. But this message was different. It was darker, sharper, and it would change everything. Samuel said, "This is what the Lord says. Go, strike the Amalekites, devote to destruction all they have. Do not spare them, all." A single word that carries more weight than anyone wants to acknowledge. We know the Amalekites were old enemies of Israel. We know they had attacked Israel long before. What we don't know, what the text never fully explains, is why this command, at this moment, had to be total. No survivors, no livestock, nothing. Saul gathered his army anyway, thousands of men, dust rising around them as they marched. Imagine walking toward a village, knowing exactly what you've been told to do, and wondering if the command makes sense. Historians disagree about this chapter. Some say ancient warfare was always brutal. Others say, even in that world, this story stands out. Either way, Saul attacked. The battle ended quickly. The command was carried out. Almost. Because Saul found the Amalekite king Agag still alive. And for reasons we can only guess, Saul kept him alive. Maybe he wanted a trophy. Maybe leverage. We don't know. Then his soldiers saw something else. Good livestock. Healthy animals. Valuable. Saul let them keep the best, saying, "We will sacrifice them." But that wasn't the command. The command was destroy everything. This small decision, this moment of hesitation, is what breaks the story open. Samuel learned what Saul had done before he arrived. The text says he cried out to God all night. We don't know what he prayed. We don't know what he heard. We just know he was devastated. When Samuel reached Saul, the king tried to act cheerful. "I carried out the Lord's command," he said. Samuel stared at him and asked, "Then why do I hear the sound of sheep?" That one question cracks the entire story apart. Samuel then delivered the verdict. "Because you rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." In a single moment, Saul's future dissolved. His dynasty ended before it began. But the darkest part wasn't over. Samuel demanded that King Agag be brought out. Agag came willingly, thinking the danger had passed. He even said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." It wasn't. What happened next is the part most churches never read aloud. The part the text leaves heavy on the page. And after it was done, Samuel turned and walked away from Saul. They never spoke again. That silence between them is almost louder than the story itself. To this day, no one agrees on how to interpret this chapter. Some say it's about obedience. Some say it's political storytelling from a violent age. Some say it's a theological metaphor, not literal history. What we know is the chapter is real. What we don't know is how much of it reflects actual events, and how much reflects the fears and beliefs of ancient writers trying to make sense of a chaotic world. But in later Jewish tradition, there's a belief that sparing Agag had consequences, that his survival allowed future enemies of Israel to be born generations later. Is that true? We can't confirm it. But the idea lingers like a shadow. And even now, no one can fully explain why this story feels less like history and more like a warning. When the soldiers walked into the ruined village, they expected the usual aftermath of war smoke, shouting, "The metal smell of blood." Instead, they found silence. A silence so thick it felt like a warning, and right in the middle of that silence stood a king. Not their king. The one man they had been told should not survive this day. But let's pull back for a moment. This story comes from a chapter in the Bible many churches quietly avoid. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. 3,000 years ago, Israel had its first king, Saul. He wasn't born into royalty. He was chosen. Chosen because the prophet Samuel said God wanted him. And when Samuel spoke, no one argued. According to those sources, Agag's survival, even for a short time, allowed him to leave behind something, a descendant, a lineage. And generations later, that lineage would rise again as an enemy of Israel. Is it historically certain? No. Is it part of the old lore? Yes. And whether it's fact or interpretation, it adds a shadow that stretches far beyond Saul's lifetime. But let's come back to Saul himself. After the confrontation, Samuel disappears from Saul's life entirely. He retreats. He mourns. He says nothing more to the king he once anointed. And Saul, suddenly cut off from divine guidance, begins to unravel. You see it in the next chapters. A kind of paranoia creeping in, a fear that sits on his shoulder, a restlessness he can't explain. And it all starts here. This one moment of disobedience, this one choice he thought was small. But the story doesn't just belong to Saul, it belongs to Samuel too. Because while Samuel delivered the message, he wasn't comfortable with it. The text shows him wrestling, grieving, crying out through the night. We never see prophets do that unless the situation is unbearable. Samuel wasn't celebrating judgment, he was crushed by it. And that's something people often miss. It's easy to paint prophets as cold and mechanical just messengers, but here, you see a man breaking under the weight of what he's been told to say. That emotional complexity is one of the reasons this chapter feels so haunting. Let me give you something small, a detail you might not notice unless you look closely. After Samuel announces that Saul has been rejected as king, Saul grabs at his robe. The text says the robe tears. And Samuel responds with a line that feels like a knife sliding quietly into place. As your hand has torn my garment, the Lord has torn the kingdom from you. It's poetic, it's symbolic, and it's devastating. Moments like this make ancient stories feel painfully human. Now, you might wonder why a single act sparing a king, sparing animals, mattered so much. Why was this the breaking point? Some scholars say the story is about total obedience. Some say it was written later to explain political failures. Some say it's theology, not history. And some say the question itself is the point. That you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. That the story isn't meant to be resolved neatly. Remember, the Bible is a library. Different voices, different eras, different purposes. This chapter sits in a part of the Bible that often reads like royal propaganda mixed with theological interpretation. It's violent, yes, but also reflective, revealing, unsettling. And there's another layer, one you don't hear in Sunday school. This event marks the beginning of the end for Saul, but it also marks the beginning of the rise of someone else, David. The boy who would kill Goliath, the man who would write Psalms, the king whose name becomes legendary, and his rise is built on Saul's fall. This chapter isn't just judgment, it's transition, a passing of the crown, long before the crown actually moves. Now, let's talk about something we almost never address. The psychological aftermath. Saul doesn't just lose his title, he loses confidence, purpose, identity. He begins to seek approval everywhere except where he needs to. He becomes consumed by comparisons, by fear of being replaced, by jealousy. You can track his downfall like a slow-moving storm. And if you look closely, the first crack in the lightning strikes here, in this story. The text even says that after this moment, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. We're not told how that felt. We're not told what it looked like. But the implication is clear. Whatever connection Saul once had, it's gone. And in its absence, something darker fills the space. Some translations call it an evil spirit. Some call it a tormenting spirit. Scholars argue about what that means. Is it supernatural? Psychological? Symbolic? We don't know. But what we know is this. Saul changed. Not suddenly, slowly, quietly, like erosion. And this change, this slow unraveling, will push Saul into paranoia, violence, obsession, even toward the edge of madness. But before we go down that road, before we talk about the haunting aftermath that shapes the rest of Saul's life, there's one question we need to sit with. Why would a story like this be in the Bible at all? Ancient people didn't soften their history. They didn't edit out the uncomfortable parts. They believed truth, even painful truth, had to be preserved. Maybe this story survived because it warns. Maybe because it explains. Maybe because it unsettles. Or maybe because it raises questions no one can fully answer. and sometimes the questions matter more than the answers. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Others think it's symbolic language for depression or anxiety. Whatever it is, Saul feels it deeply. It comes in waves, moments where the room feels smaller, the shadows darker, the air heavier. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just a slow tightening around the edges of his mind. And here's the eerie part. People around him notice. They bring him musicians, hoping the music will calm him, something soothing to drown out the fear clawing at his thoughts. One of those musicians is David. Imagine that. The future king playing music to ease the mind of the king he will one day replace. And for a while, it works. The room lightens. Saul breathes again. The tension loosens. Others think it's symbolic language for depression or anxiety. Whatever it is, Saul feels it deeply. It comes in waves, moments where the room feels smaller, the shadows darker, the air heavier. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just a slow tightening around the edges of his mind. And here's the eerie part. People around him notice. They bring him musicians, hoping the music will calm him, something soothing to drown out the fear clawing at his thoughts. One of those musicians is David. Imagine that. The future king playing music to ease the mind of the king he will one day replace. And for a while, it works. The room lightens. Saul breathes again. The tension loosens. Little choices, small suspicions, tiny ruptures in trust. Then one night, after another victory, after another song praising David more loudly than him, Saul looks at David with a new expression. Not anger, not hatred, fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. As if David isn't a young musician standing in front of him, but a shadow reaching for his crown. And that's when Saul makes the quiet decision that will haunt the rest of the story. He decides that David isn't just talented, or lucky, or blessed. He decides David is dangerous, not because of anything David has done, but because of what Saul has been told will happen. The crown will leave him. Little choices, small suspicions, tiny ruptures in trust. Then one night, after another victory, after another song praising David more loudly than him, Saul looks at David with a new expression. Not anger, not hatred, fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. As if David isn't a young musician standing in front of him, but a shadow reaching for his crown. And that's when Saul makes the quiet decision that will haunt the rest of the story. He decides that David isn't just talented, or lucky, or blessed. He decides David is dangerous, not because of anything David has done, but because of what Saul has been told will happen. The crown will leave him. This is ancient Israel, and stories like this never end softly. There's a moment coming, a moment that will shatter whatever is left of Saul's confidence and push him into a decision so desperate, so strange, that even his closest advisors won't understand it. But we'll get there. For now, Saul sits in his throne room. David plays music. The soldiers whisper, "Samuel is gone." And God is silent. Something changes the night Saul realizes he can no longer predict David. Up until now, David has been predictable. A warrior, a musician, a loyal servant, a young man who bows when he's supposed to bow. But there's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when Saul sees something in David's eyes he can't explain. Not rebellion, not arrogance, calm. A calm Saul doesn't have, and that calm terrifies him more than any sword ever could. Because Saul knows what calm looks like. He had it once, before Samuel left, before the commands, before the silence. When Saul looks at David now, he sees something unfamiliar, a man who isn't afraid, and nothing is more dangerous to an insecure king than someone who cannot be intimidated. One evening, the musicians gather to calm Saul's mind, just like before. The air is soft, the lamps flicker. David sits nearby, playing the same melodies that once soothed the king. But tonight, Saul isn't soothed. He watches David's hands moving across the strings, watches the focus in his eyes, watches the ease in the room, and something in Saul breaks. He feels the old prophecy hovering above them like a shadow. "The kingdom is torn from you." Saul looks at David, looks at the harp, looks at the calm, and the thought appears in his mind, as quietly as a breath. He is the one Samuel meant, the one chosen in his place, the one God has moved toward. And suddenly the room feels smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves are leaning inward. Saul's hand closes around something beside him, not in anger, not even in conscious choice, almost like his body moves before he thinks. David keeps playing. Soft notes, a melody built to heal. But Saul doesn't hear the music anymore. He hears Samuel's voice. He hears the verdict. He hears the kingdom tearing away. The text describes what happens next in the simplest language possible, almost like it wants to hide how dramatic the moment truly was. But imagine it. A king, a young musician, a room full of people who don't yet understand what is unfolding. And Saul, no longer seeing David as a servant, but as a threat, as destiny closing in. That moment marks the beginning of a long, bitter path for Saul. A path shaped not by violence, but by fear. Fear that grows quiet roots and spreads into everything he touches. From here on, Saul will not look at David the same way again. Not with trust, not with affection, not even with neutrality, only suspicion. And suspicion, once it settles into a king's heart, does something no enemy army can do. It corrodes. Because from this point forward, every victory David wins looks like a step toward Saul's throne. Every cheer from the crowds sounds like betrayal. Every time David walks into the room, Saul wonders if he's looking at the future king, the man who will take everything from him. But here's the part that makes the story even darker. David has no idea. He isn't plotting. He isn't maneuvering. He isn't trying to steal anything. He just plays the harp. He leads soldiers. He serves the king. He does everything right. And sometimes, doing everything right is the very thing that makes other people afraid of you. Saul starts to watch David the way a hunter watches movement in tall grass, not because he sees danger, but because he expects it. And expectation has a strange way of becoming reality. There's a line later in the text that says Saul eyed David from that day forward. It's such a small sentence, so simple, but it changes the course of the entire story. Because an eye like that is not neutral. It's waiting. It's searching. It's preparing for something that hasn't happened and may never happen, but feels inevitable. And here's the quiet tragedy. Saul isn't fighting David. He's fighting a prophecy, a verdict spoken over him, a future he can't escape. Samuel has disappeared into the distance. God is silent. David is rising. And Saul is unraveling. Not loudly, not violently, quietly. The kind of unraveling that happens in the spaces between words, in late-night thoughts, in the echo of a song played by someone you're beginning to fear. And if you look closely, you can almost feel it. This is the moment when Saul realizes he's no longer the main character of his own story. Someone else has stepped into that role. And nothing terrifies a king more than becoming a background figure in the kingdom he was chosen to lead. Saul can't sleep. Not really. Not the kind of sleep that rests you. Just the kind that drags you under for a moment, lets you breathe once, then drops you back into the dark. He hears things now, not voices, just sounds, footsteps in the hall, whispers behind doors, people saying David's name a little too softly. It eats at him, because Saul remembers the moment things were simple, when he was chosen, when he mattered, when the world felt like it had space for him. But now every room feels crowded. Even when he's alone, especially when he's alone. He walks through the palace and notices small things. A servant smiling at David, a soldier nodding, a priest lingering a little too long in conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, just normal life. And sometimes, normal life is what hurts most. Because Saul knows what normal used to feel like, and this isn't it. David keeps winning battles, keeps earning loyalty, keeps shining in ways Saul no longer can. And the worst part? David doesn't try. He isn't bragging. He isn't scheming. He's just David. And that simplicity drives Saul insane. One evening, Saul stands alone by a window. The wind pushes in, cool, sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distance. He looks down at the courtyard, sees David talking with a group of soldiers. They laugh. They lean in. They trust him. And Saul feels something cold slide across his ribs, something thin, something quiet, fear, not fear of David hurting him, fear of David replacing him. a fear that grows like a shadow stretching across the floor. Saul closes his eyes. For a moment, he just listens. To the wind, to the stone shifting under his feet, to his own breath flattening into something shallow. He whispers to himself, not a prayer, not a thought, more like a question bleeding into the air. Why him? No answer, just silence. Silence thick enough to choke on. And then, a memory. Samuel's voice. Soft, stern, final. The Lord has torn the kingdom from you. It stayed. Saul hears those words like a nail tapping, tapping into the back of his skull. He grips the window frame, knuckles white, jaw tight. This is how a king breaks. Not with a scream, but with a slow, quiet collapse. He watches David one more time. The boy smiles. The soldiers smile back. Saul feels something settle in him. Not peace, not acceptance, decision. A decision born from fear wrapped in prophecy. A decision that will turn the story dark in a way even he doesn't fully understand yet. He steps back from the window, his face calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that feels dangerous. Because once a king convinces himself that the threat is real, the next step is inevitable. Saul starts watching people the way a storm watches the horizon. Quiet, wide-eyed, waiting for something to confirm the fear already growing inside him. Every smile David receives, every compliment, every, "Did you see what he did today?" whispered in the halls. Saul hears all of it, even when no one is speaking, because fear rewires your ears. You stop hearing what people say. You only hear what you're afraid they're thinking. And Saul thinks they're thinking one thing: David is the real king. He never says it out loud. He doesn't have to. The thought sits just behind his heartbeat, pulsing, constant. Meanwhile, David keeps being David, kind, brave, blindingly confident in a way that isn't loud, just effortless. And that effortlessness is exactly what breaks Saul. One evening, Saul walks into the hall where David and the musicians usually gather. The room glows with warm lamplight. Shadows sway across the walls. Everything feels calm. But Saul's mind is anything but calm. He watches David tuning his instrument. Small, gentle movements. Hands steady. Face relaxed. A normal moment. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because Saul realizes something. David isn't pretending. David isn't hiding. David isn't even trying to be impressive. He simply is. And Saul isn't. The difference hits him like cold water down his spine. He stands there, silent, while the music starts. Soft notes. Steady. Comforting. They used to help him. They used to bring him peace. Now they feel like a reminder of everything slipping out of his control. Saul's breathing changes. Slow. Shallow. A tremor in the exhale. The musicians don't notice. David doesn't notice. But Saul does. He feels the fear creeping up the back of his neck. Feels his chest tighten. Feels the prophecy pressing down again. Whispering, "The kingdom isn't yours anymore." The music swells. David looks up, his face open. Honest. Unaware. And Saul suddenly understands something he's been trying to avoid. The real threat isn't David's strength. It isn't his popularity. It isn't even God's favor. It's the future. A future that seems to bend toward David, and away from Saul. And once a king starts fearing the future, the present becomes unbearable. Saul steps back. His hand trembles. His jaw locks. He watches David the way a drowning man watches the surface. Close enough to see, far enough to lose. A single thought crosses Saul's mind. Sharp, quiet, unwelcome. If he's gone, the future stops moving. The moment he thinks it, he hates it. The moment he hates it, he thinks it again. Fear does that. It turns thoughts into echoes, echoes into patterns, patterns into plans. But Saul isn't ready. Not yet. He just stands there, still, frozen between two versions of himself. The king he used to be, and the king fear is turning him into, and in that silence, the kingdom shifts. Not with a shout, not with a battle cry, with a thought, a small, dangerous thought. The kind that changes everything. Saul begins to see danger everywhere now. Not real danger. Just shadows wearing the shape of his fears. David becomes the biggest shadow of all. At first, Saul tells himself he's being cautious. A good king. A responsible king. Watching a rising star to make sure it doesn't burn too hot. But fear has a way of changing its name. Caution becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes threat. Threat becomes destiny. And Saul believes destiny is turning against him. Reports start coming in from the battlefield. David wins. Again, and again, and again. The people chant his name. The soldiers trust him. The nation leans toward him the way flowers lean toward light. Meanwhile, Saul feels himself dimming. Every victory David brings home feels like a piece of Saul's authority being carried away in the crowd's applause. Every cheer sounds like footsteps. Footsteps walking toward his throne. He tries to ignore it. He tries to breathe. He tries to be rational. But fear doesn't negotiate. One night, after another celebration, Saul watches David from across the hall. The boy smiles. The people adore him. And Saul feels something inside him, something small, something human. Snap. He can't sit still anymore. He stands, walks, paces. Thoughts swirl like smoke around his head. If he lives, he will rise. If he rises, the kingdom falls. If the kingdom falls, I fall with it. Fear is rarely logical, but it is always persuasive. Saul calls his guards, his voice low, tired, but edged with something sharp. He gives an order, not shouted, just spoken, soft enough to hide the panic, hard enough to feel final. David must be watched, monitored, cornered, and eventually, removed. The guards don't question him. Kings don't get questioned. And so it begins. A hunt. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not announced. A quiet hunt, the kind that doesn't start with weapons, but with suspicion, and ends with a man running for his life. David has no idea. Not tonight. Not yet. He still plays music for the king. Still fights Saul's battles. Still honors the man who once called him beloved. But Saul doesn't see a harp player anymore. He doesn't see a warrior. He doesn't see a friend. He sees the prophecy. He sees Samuel's voice. Hear it again. The kingdom is torn from you. And when Saul looks at David, he sees the one holding the other end of that torn kingdom. From this moment on, Saul cannot rest. He cannot breathe easily. He cannot look at David without feeling the ground tilt beneath his feet. Paranoia becomes his companion. Silence becomes his torment. David becomes the threat he must, eventually, remove. And the tragedy? David still loves Saul, still trusts him, still believes they stand on the same side. But fear has already chosen its side. And it isn't Saul's. This is the moment, quiet, hidden, barely visible, when the story stops being political and becomes personal. A king falling, a future rising, a prophecy tightening its grip, and the hunt is only just beginning. Saul reaches a point no king ever wants to reach. Silence. Total silence. Not from his soldiers. Not from his people. From God, he prays. Nothing. He sacrifices. Nothing. He begs for dreams, visions, signs, but the sky stays closed. And when a man believes heaven has stopped listening, he starts listening to darker places. Trouble arrives fast. The Philistine armies gather again. Massive. Organized. Threatening to swallow Israel whole. Saul sees them lined across the valley, torches glowing, shields gleaming. A wall of enemies stretching into the dark. His heart locks up, his breath shortens. This is the kind of moment Samuel used to guide him through. But Samuel is gone, dead, buried, silence. Saul asks the priests what to do. They wait for an answer. Nothing. Saul is alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. And that's when someone whispers a name, a place, a possibility so forbidden that even saying it feels like breaking something sacred. Endor, a small village, hidden, quiet. And in that village, a woman, a medium, a necromancer, a person Saul himself outlawed years ago, back when he still believed the law would protect him. Now, the law doesn't matter. Desperation does. Saul disguises himself, cloak pulled tight, face hidden. Only 2 soldiers accompany him through the night. The journey is long, colder than he expected. Every step feels like a line he is crossing. Every shadow looks like it knows. He reaches the house just before dawn. A faint lantern burns inside, flickering through cracks in the walls. He knocks. The door opens only a few inches. An eye appears. Sharp. Suspicious. The woman studies him. His cloak. His voice. His presence. She knows danger when she smells it. and Saul smells like danger. I cannot help you, she says. Saul has banned my kind. And here, in the dim light of a stranger's doorway, Saul lies. Don't be afraid, he whispers. No harm will come to you. The irony is almost cruel. The king who outlawed her art is now begging for it. She hesitates. Fear moves across her face like a shadow, but curiosity wins. Who do you want me to call up? They're the mufted name. Saul's answer comes out like a wound tearing open. Samuel. The woman freezes. Her breath catches. Even she has limits. But Saul insists, his voice trembling, his hands shaking. She begins her ritual. No flames. No spinning lights. No theatrics. Just a stillness. An unnatural stillness. The kind that makes the air feel too heavy to breathe. And then, she gasps, steps back. Her eyes widen with genuine terror. Why did you deceive me? She cries. You are Saul. Saul doesn't react. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't blink. Because he sees something too. Something rising in the shadows behind her. Something shaped like a man. Old. Familiar. Draped in the weight of the grave. Samuel. Or something wearing Samuel's shape. The text doesn't tell us exactly what this is. A spirit? A vision? A nightmare? A judgment? We only know Saul believes it, completely. He falls to the ground, his voice barely a breath. What should I do? And the figure, whatever it is, speaks, not gently, not lovingly, with the cold certainty of a door closing forever. You disobeyed the command. The kingdom is gone. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. Saul stops breathing for a moment, not literally, just emotionally. Spiritually, he has been afraid of losing the kingdom for years. Now he learns he will lose something far worse. Himself. He collapses. Weak. Shaking. Broken. The woman, ironically, shows more compassion than anyone else around him. She feeds him, helps him up, sends him back into the night. And Saul leaves Endor with nothing. No hope. No guidance. No future. Just a prophecy echoing inside him like a slow, distant drum. Tomorrow. And as he rides back toward the battlefield, the sky begins to lighten, but nothing about it feels like morning. If you're still with me, hit like and subscribe. I post once a week. Morning comes, but it doesn't feel like morning. The sky is pale, colorless, like even the sun is too afraid to shine. Saul stands at the edge of the battlefield. Philistine armies fill the valley below. Shields, spears, chariots, stretching out like a metal tide. Behind him, his sons prepare for war. Good men. Brave men, unaware that a prophecy hangs over their heads like a blade. Saul's hands shake, not from fear of the enemy, but from something colder. Resignation. He already knows the outcome. He heard it in Endor. He saw it in the shadow that wore Samuel's face. Tomorrow, you will be with me. The battle begins. Screams. Metal. Dust. But the text does something strange here. It doesn't linger on the violence. It doesn't track every blow. It stays with Saul, a king fighting a war he has already lost. His sons fall first, one by one, a grief too heavy to describe. So the scripture doesn't try, and Saul realizes something heartbreaking. The prophecy wasn't punishment, it was a timetable, a whisper telling him how long he had left to breathe. He looks around. His army is collapsing, the Philistines closing in, the world shrinking. He tries to run, but a wounded man cannot outrun destiny. He stumbles, falls. The ground rises up to meet him, and in that moment, the king who once stood taller than anyone in Israel, now lies smaller than everyone. There is one last thought in him. Not anger, not fear. Relief. The story that has been unraveling for years finally reaches its end. And somewhere, whether in heaven, or in judgment, or in the memory of a broken prophet, Samuel's words settle into place. The kingdom is torn from you. And out of the tearing, another name rises. David, the shepherd boy, the musician, the calm presence in the throne room, the man Saul feared long before he ever understood why. But this story, Saul's story, isn't about David stealing anything. It's about a king who couldn't escape his own unraveling, a king haunted by silence, by prophecy, by choices that echoed louder than his victories. Saul's body is taken by the Philistines, hung on a wall, exposed, humiliated. But that's not the real ending. The real ending is quieter, darker, more human. It's the nation standing still, the people stunned, the legacy cracked. Israel's first king, the man chosen by God, dies not as a hero or a villain, but as a warning about fear, about obedience, about the weight of divine expectations and the cost of failing them. 3,000 years later, this chapter still makes readers uncomfortable, still raises questions with no easy answers, still whispers something unsettling about human nature. And maybe that's why your church will never read it on a Sunday morning, because some stories aren't meant to comfort. Some stories are meant to haunt. If you liked this story, hit like and subscribe.